first heard about the idea of transhumanism around 2010. Of course, the term itself has a much longer history, apparently first coined in its modern usage by the futurist who called himself FM 2030, a name change expressing the author's desire to live until 2030, although he died in 2000. Another futurist and advocate for radical life extension, Max Moore, crafted a definition for transhumanism back in 1990, describing the term as signifying, quote, a class of philosophies of life that seek the continuation and acceleration of the evolution of intelligent life beyond its currently human form and human limitations by means of science and technology, end quote. Naturally, I was familiar with such ideas from science fiction movies and books, something like cyborgs or technologically advanced humans. I suppose what struck me as so troubling at the time was how seriously transhumanism was presented. Transhumanism accepted as a given the notion that A, human beings and technology could in fact merge, and B, that this was a goal to be pursued. It was no longer an imaginative trope in a piece of genre storytelling, or a form of societal or cultural critique, which is how many mid-20th century science fiction writers used these ideas. Now it was being advocated that something out of a science fiction story should be brought forth into reality, in fact, replace the existing reality with what seemed to be a science fiction story. Of course, there is nothing entirely new under the sun. The history of scientific discovery, technological innovation, and art or entertainment was always already intertwined in generative and productive ways, meaning that each area symbiotically inspired the others, causing real changes and practical results. Just think of the Star Trek franchise, for example. Someone who grew up watching Star Trek later becomes a scientist or engineer and draws on their childhood memories of watching Star Trek episodes to come up with new ideas and make discoveries, often unconsciously. And so it goes. But the central tenets of the Transhumanism project, namely that human beings and technology ought to merge in some fashion, whether out of survival or moral responsibility, troubled me, even as I recognized that we are already merged to some degree with our technological inventions, eyeglasses being the typical example. But I wanted to know more about this idea and its history. When I decided to pursue my doctorate, this line of inquiry merged with another, that being my interest in spirituality, magic, and esotericism. It even tried to take over, as I applied with research projects to institutions like Arizona State, which at the time had a program called Facing the Challenges of Transhumanism, Religion, Science, Technology, which was funded by a Templeton grant. In the end, my proposal pursuing research in the history of esotericism and religion was stronger, and so I decided to make this my focus, for which I'm glad I did. However, I kept up with the swirling trends around transhumanism, both in popular and scholarly imaginations, and I was always impressed by the level of momentum and traction this idea gained. During my studies, I was introduced to one of my future dissertation advisors through a graduate seminar that was being offered, the title of which immediately caught my attention, Technogenesis. Grafting together these two words is clear enough, techno as in technology, and genesis, that is origins and beginnings. This was apparently a concept that had been popularized by scholars like French archaeologist and anthropologist André Gourand, the French philosopher Bernard Stiegler, and the American media studies theorist Mark Hansen. It posits a link between the biological evolution of humans and the development of technology, or more precisely, tools and techniques. Furthermore, that technology itself forms the horizon of what we as humans can experience. This theory connects to the larger trajectory of the history and philosophy of technology. A useful illustration is given in the well-known opening scene of Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey, in which the appearance of an alien monolith symbolizing technology, or that which is artificial, inspires one hominid to develop a tool from the bone of a dead animal, enabling control over the natural environment and triggering an evolutionary step for the entire species. Here, then, was an idea that helped bring into focus for me that which is embedded in the transhumanism project, namely, the connection between technology and the natural mechanisms of evolution. I attended this graduate seminar and subsequently every other course offered by this particular professor, who eventually graciously agreed to be on my dissertation committee. I learned a great deal, all of which motivated me to apply for a graduate minor or emphasis in the field of science and technology studies, solidifying my two seemingly disconnected interests, the history of esotericism and the relationship between humans and machines. As I would come to find out, while at first this seemed like an odd combination, it was in reality not uncommon, and many of the thinkers and artists I associated with the history of esotericism had engaged in precisely this endeavor. Such a combination is apparent in my dissertation topic itself, a comparison of the ideas and biographies of, on the one hand, the founder of the esoteric cultural renewal movement Anthroposophy, Rudolf Steiner, and on the other, one of the forefathers and legitimizers of the field of social science, that is, a science that takes human culture seriously, Max Weber. Bringing these two thinkers together reflects the overlapping fields of esotericism and human Geist or spirit with the development of technology. At the time, I was also reading a book that was more spiritually explicit in its orientation by the popular philosopher and cultural historian of ancient religions, Jeremy Nadler, which was entitled In the Shadow of the Machine, The Prehistory of the Computer and the Evolution of Consciousness. This book tracks the idea that the raw materials of nature, forged by something divine, were first given charge to human beings, and for thousands of years people invented increasingly complex tools to reshape the materiality of the natural world. Collegia, priesthoods, guilds, and other orders were established to implement these material constructions, aligning their creations with utilitarian and spiritual aspirations. The secrets of technology and science were, in this narrative, confined mostly to the religious register and were therefore safeguarded from total misuse. However, the rise of explicitly modern scientific knowledge and technology severed human beings from close contact with the gods and the divine, disrupting humanity's original understanding of itself and its place in the cosmos. Far from being a rehash of old anti-modern critiques of the Romantics, Nadler, who has a background in the esotericism of anthroposophy, puts forward a case similar to that of the Technogenesists. That is, the history of the development of technology is linked for Nadler to the evolution of human consciousness or cognition, which is to say that material technological objects are extensions of our spirit. They are that which has been brought forth from out of ourselves, and therefore represent the reflection of our own divinely ordained creative activity. Needless to say, for Nadler, modern technological achievements in artificial intelligence, communications technology, smartphones, and the dreaded 5G installations, as well as computers, have disconnected us from our spiritual relationship to each other and the world, exchanging our spiritual potential for trust in machines. With these two interlinking threads, the idea of technogenesis and the notion that the development of technology and human consciousness evolution are mutually constitutive, I was better prepared to approach one of the major aspects of my dissertation, namely how Steiner and Weber thematized technology. While not immediately connected in this regard, the idea of transhumanism does, in part, form the background of my research questions and my overall interest in the history of technology. What is, of course, lurking behind all this, as we shall see, is the impact of technology on the natural environment, or rather, the exchange between material creations designed through a specific scientific logic and the externally organic, which to us is experienced as a given. New technology has always given people a thrill, revealing perhaps its synergistic relationship to the central nervous system. With respect to modern technology, a great deal of importance should be placed on the invention of the steam pump, an event Steiner referred to as a new fall for humanity in the sense of the biblical story. I want to focus briefly on a direct result of that discovery, the steam engine or locomotive. The tremendous power and speed of the railways became a fascination for Europeans during the 19th century, many purchasing tickets merely for the thrill of transcending space and time while moving about the train. H.G. Wells, commenting in 1901, wrote that, quote, "The 19th century, when it takes its place with the other centuries in the chronological charts of the future, will, if it needs a symbol, almost inevitably have as that symbol a steam engine running upon a railway." End quote. The effect of railway travel was often referred to in terms of the annihilation of space and time, as trains hurled along at over 30 miles an hour, much faster than horse travel. While the trains provided access to previously unreachable places, it did so by annihilating space itself and the identity of a location, including that place's specialness. As the writer John Ruskin observed, passengers ceased to be travelers who interacted with the places through which they traveled, but became parcels to be delivered. Psychological fears of a potential accident in connection with steam locomotives produced empirical changes in human mental and physical health, often in ways not intended by engineers and developers. When trains were introduced in Europe, for example, one of the unforeseen consequences was the emergence of new mental illnesses. As the first accidents began to occur in the 1850s, they were heavily covered in the local press and coincided with new psychological cases of people who were nervous and afraid of being on the train when it went off the rails. Not only that, those people who had been aboard during accidents developed new kinds of injury, physical and psychological, which posed problems for psychologists and doctors. One scholar reports that a phenomenon called a railway spine, which is the neurosis that results from train injuries and traumas, came to be recognized. Such historical accounts alert us to the direct relationship between material technology and the human physical body and intellectual spirit. Weber and Steiner lived in the middle of this dynamic period, and their ideas about technology and its relationship to human beings, nature, and society are best viewed against this backdrop. So I wanted to come out into nature to really sort of experience what it's like to be surrounded by nature rather than surrounded by a city or in your apartment where you're surrounded by appliances or something. And so this is related to just an overall deep contemplation I've been having about the planet, about the environment, about the climate, about the state of our current conditions. And so I just wanted to come out here to kind of get away and to think about it. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what Steiner believed about nature and what he had to say about it. And I've just spent the last few weeks really digging into his texts and trying to figure out, what was he saying about nature and about technology. And I finished that, and I'm currently working on what Weber had to say about nature and technology. He had also a lot to say about both of these subjects, which are related for both of them, but he also had something to say that was quite different. So I'm comparing them also to the ideas of Heidegger, Karl Jaspers, Marcuse, Hannah Arendt, these other thinkers who also wrote about technology and about the dangers or the benefits that technology can bring to humans. But to focus on Steiner, after reading through what he had to say in particular essays and going back to the German to really sort of pick apart the words he chose to use, after sort of distilling all that in my brain, the picture that I came out with that he seems to be saying is that the elemental world where we currently are sitting now, this is the world of nature for him. And by the way, he's picking up this idea from Goethe. He studied Goethe. He very much liked Goethe's ideas about nature and science. And Goethe had this idea that if you could go out into nature, you could see the kind of blueprint that nature forms itself out of. The forces of nature follow this blueprint like an architect would, and they build up the plants and the trees and the natural environment out of these blueprints. So building off of that, Steiner brings into it a whole other level of this esoteric philosophy. So for him, being out in nature like this is being surrounded by the elemental spirits or the elemental beings, which are sort of traditionally like the fairies and the gnomes and the fae and these sort of nature spirits that live out here. And this is their kingdom. The elves too, we have to include the elves and the gnomes also. So anyway, what Steiner's picture is that he puts out to his readers and his audience at the time when he was alive and lecturing about these subjects, is that in the elemental world, similar to what Goethe said, these elemental beings, they're the ones who construct what's out here. They build it up according to their sort of divinely ordained or at least spiritually actualized blueprint of what a tree, what a rock, what a hill, what a plant, what all of this is supposed to look like and how it's supposed to sort of function in a symbiosis harmony. The nature spirits are the ones who not only bring that about, but they're the ones who are like the custodians of it also. So that's the nature part. He then is talking about technology in relation to that. And what he says is that anytime that human beings come into nature to extract resources, natural resources and materials for their own constructions and their own things they want to build, every time they do that, they drive out the nature spirits and the elemental beings from whatever materials they extracted from the natural environment. The nature spirits and the elementals contained in these materials are driven out and they're sort of hauled away, we could say, and then later used to build something else, build something that was designed by a human being rather than by the nature spirits. So he says that when human beings build something new out of their own design, out of these materials, every time they do that, they provide the opportunity for a demonic spirit, which these demonic spirits we could say are sort of the opposite of the nature spirits. They're the spirits living in, like for Steiner, things like electricity and these sort of other forces that don't necessarily resemble this external phenomenon of the natural environment that we see with our five senses, let's say. So these other beings, and he says every time we build something, we do this. So we could be building a chair, actually. But when we take these resources out and we construct something new, it offers the opportunity for a demonic spirit to enter into that piece of construction that we've done. Anything from a chair to a cell phone, we could say. And I think there's probably a sort of hierarchy of demons that can embody these things. So he says that because of that, that sort of spiritual process, we are surrounded by these demonic spirits all the time because we're surrounded by things that we built ourselves out of our own plan. So we're sort of permeating ourselves with them all the time, is what he says. And we live in this environment of demonic spirits when we live in our constructed environment. Now, he doesn't say that that's a bad thing, because that sounds pretty terrible when you first hear it. What he says is that it's absolutely necessary, that this is part of the divine plan of what's supposed to happen here on this planet in his cosmology. So according to his own philosophy, which has this sort of German idealistic element mixed with the Theosophical Society and their ideas that he joined in 1902, when you bring these ideas together, he has this whole other cosmology, and a central part of it is this notion of technology, that human beings must build the world according to their own inner thoughts and ideas and feelings. But when they do that, they bring in this demonic element into all the stuff around them. So therefore, nature, of course, is obviously very important. In someone like Steiner's system, nature is not supposed to be driven out or something. In fact, it's supposed to be worshipped, and it's supposed to be preserved and in communion with, in the way Goethe talked about it. You study nature by worshiping it. It's a little bit similar to when I'm talking about Heidegger or even Karl Jaspers, because Karl Jaspers also believed that there was some sort of demonism of technology, as he called it. And he was being more figurative, whereas Steiner is actually wanting to believe in these beings that he's talking about, whereas Karl Jaspers is using sort of a metaphor. But he says that when society uses all of these technologies to function and sort of rely on, that they just sort of grow exponentially out of control. They create a sort of mass environment and a mass mindset rather than an individualistic one. People are sort of turned into this herd mentality or this mass culture. And he calls this the apparatus. So this apparatus is built using the technology in the cities and in the urban environments, and then this thing sort of snowballs out of control, and he calls this the demonism of technology. He later then sort of rethought his ideas a little bit after World War II, I think, and he then was a little bit more, put more emphasis on technology is actually neutral, and that it can be turned into this sort of demonic onslaught, but it can also be used to construct things that help human beings and help the environment. And that's a little bit what Steiner says, because he talks about these demons uniting with the things we build, the technologies that we build, but that it is possible, if you have a sort of reverent attitude, to build kinds of technologies that are harmonious with nature and human beings, actually, rather than destructive to them. Particularly their sort of spiritual well-being is what he's focused on. But he has this sort of theodicy in his cosmology, and this theodicy is an old philosophical or theological idea about the problem of evil. How can there be a God who is good when there's evil in the world? So philosophers and theologians have tried to argue about why that is the case, and Steiner has his own version of this, and has to do with these demonic beings coming in through technology, which he says we have to bring them in, and we have to unite ourselves with them, and we have to let them sort of embody us too and possess us by surrounding ourselves with this technology. However, his sort of solution to all that is not only the potential for building more sympathetic technologies, but even in that sense, he seems to be saying that that's not going to sort of solve it per se, that this sort of fate of the demons and the technology being connected to us is unavoidable, inescapable, and so we have to let these technological demons enter into us willingly as a sort of sacrifice, and then we have to transform them internally through our own sort of alchemical process of spiritual development, by taking a sort of reverent attitude and expressing love and being cheerful and positive about whatever comes to meet you in the world, that this process, according to him, will kind of transform these demonic spirits into spirits of good. So Max Weber has a similar, yet in a lot of ways quite different idea about technology, and I'm still working on this right now. But he's, of course, famous for talking about this iron cage of reason, for writing about bureaucracy and the disenchantment of the world. So in a nutshell, his idea is that increased instrumental rationality, which is like this technical rationality that I'm talking about, this type of thinking, the technology that it turns into is increased bureaucratic structures and bureaucratic processes that govern all aspects of life. So he says that once that happens, and the more this bureaucracy sort of expands and this type of thinking expands, that the world becomes trapped in what he calls this iron cage of reason, and you're stuck in rational thinking and you can't get out of it. Human freedom is obviously limited, and that this disenchants the world. However, even though he sort of presents this gloomy scenario, if you read his biography, if you read biographies about him and his wife's biography about him, and particularly more recent work, which has gone back to really look at his life and the people he hung out with, he also had a very sympathetic attitude towards nature, towards romantic poetry, and he hung out in Ascona in Switzerland, where there is a colony known as Monteverta, where lots of sort of political radicals and vegetarians and feminists and nudists and fascists and communists, the whole mix at the beginning of the 20th century, hung out at this place, and artists and writers. It was a real sort of hotbed for these alternative ideas during this time. And Weber went there several times. He was connected with a lot of the people there. He had relationships with some of the women who were really connected to this area. And he went there for the same reason a lot of these other people did, because the natural environment is so overwhelming around the lake that is there in Tessin. So he also understood, even if he didn't incorporate it into his philosophical system the way Steiner did, he definitely also understood and appreciated nature as important, as a sort of antidote or sort of binary opposite to this technology problem.
Thus, for both Steiner and Weber, the unending development of advanced technologies and the overbearing reliance on machines and technical rationality results in the opening of an abyss of demons, a maelstrom of chaotic energies that atrophy the world and society and curtail human freedom. Concerns surrounding technology, or technoscience, as it is sometimes called, are as relevant today as they were in Steiner's and Weber's time. Meanwhile, my attention has remained attuned to the continued currency of the concept of transhumanism. As our world is being reshaped in surprising and unprecedented ways, and as the natural environment plummets ever more into a crisis, I return to Weber and Steiner and their thoughts on these issues, as I myself try to make sense of the chaos.